Hey everybody, welcome to episode 5 of the Ilizwi Moja Africa podcast. So Ilizwi is a Xhosa word meaning voice. Moja is a Kiswahili word meaning one. Our aim is to create a platform for the youth in Africa to come together and have one voice. We aim to be a platform where young African people, particularly young African women, can voice out opinions about different topics from the African perspective in the realm of politics. So my name is Lindile Mthembu, or SLEE for short. I'm an academic reviewer from South Africa with extensive research on political science, particularly feminist theory and human rights. I have a master's degree in political science. So allow me to introduce my co-host, Harry Rianga from Kenya. Harry is a pastor, author, and leadership coach at Shuja Rising Consulting. Suja is a Kiswahili word meaning hero, warrior, brave. She believes everyone is a shuja, and she aims to empower people with leadership skills so that they can become the shuja God created them to be. So we also have Glenila Nzinisa, who is an ecologist from the Kingdom of Eswatini. Her interests are in youth advocacy and climate justice. She has a strong academic background in conservation ecology. She volunteers full-time with international and local environmental organizations.
Thank you, Slee. Today, we're privileged to have a special guest who will help us delve more into our topic and enrich our discussions. I'm happy to introduce Dikulere Kuti Banda, who is passionate about bridging health system gaps and advancing gender equality and equity in global health. As a public health specialist, she has over 8 years experience working with over 300 healthcare workers from over 9 provinces of Zambia. She has a master's degree in public health policy and management from the University of Zambia, and Tiku has co-investigated on a number of research projects and currently works as a community engagement expert with ICARS and Eden University on antimicrobial resistance research study aimed at improving the management of urinary tract infections among women in Zambia. Tiku is a 2022 Mandela Washington Fellowship alumni, 2018 Global Health Corps Fellow alumni, and part of the Women in Global Health Zambian chapter, where she serves as a research coordinator.
Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We kicked off the year with a series on decolonization. In January, our episode was about decolonization of the mind. In February, we celebrated International Mother Language Day by holding a Twitter chat where we discussed ways of decolonizing language. In March, we went on to discuss decolonization of culture and ended April with a discussion on decolonizing conservation. So before we start, please follow us on Twitter at Ilizwi Moja or on Facebook at Ilizwi Moja to continue our conversations. Also, like our video and subscribe to our channel. Also, feel free to comment as we continue with our discussion. We would like to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Great. So today, guys, we're going into the final episode of our Decolonization series. Like, can you believe it? Our neocolonial economies. So before we dive in, let's actually conceptualize this term neocolonialism. In its simplest form, neocolonialism is the perpetual influence of former colonial masters over African countries through interventions in politics, economic policy, and security. So let's actually go into the brief background into neocolonialism, and we can look into a very recent case study, the DRC. What happened there? So on July 28, 2022, the country's government auctioned 27 oil blocks and 3 gas blocks. The repercussion is that the government is selling off its rainforest and its other natural treasures for multinational corporations from the Western states to extract gas and oil. So the government has justified this auction by stating that it's an act of nationalism to advance its economy. However, recent development has uncovered that the DRC has postponed its plans to allow oil companies to drill in its rainforests and peatlands. While these 27 oil blocks have been delayed, the government has auctioned off 3 gas blocks to US and Canadian companies. So that actually brings us to our question. The DRC is adamant that they are selling off its rainforests for national interests, so to essentially advance its economy. However, do you think that the Western states are once again scrambling for African resources? So what do you think, guys? What are your stance on this? Do you think that the Western states are actually scrambling for Africa's resources?
Yeah, definitely. I think they've been doing that for some time. And unfortunately, I feel DRC is probably the most country where we see a lot of Western countries coming in to get their resources. And I think this has been evidenced by the civil wars that, quote unquote, not civil, but being funded by the Western world as a ploy to destabilize the country and yeah, get as many resources as possible. I think we all heard from the recent article where I think a UN agency vehicle flipped in Congo, and when it flipped, it had minerals attached to the vehicle. So yeah, I do feel that they've been doing that for some time, and I think that is one of the reasons why Congo up to date still has this civil unrest in the country.
Definitely.
If I may also just contribute to what Tiku has said, I think Congo it's a tragic situation because it's the most endowed country in the world. I was just reading up and I found out that it's one of the wealthiest countries in terms of untapped resources, and it has an estimated 24 trillion US dollars in untapped mineral deposits. With the world's largest reserve in coltan, which is used to make like cell phones. So I mean, it's like a breadbasket for Africa. It's like the pot of gold in Africa, and of course, the West wants to have their fingers in it. They've been having their fingers in it since pre-colonial times, colonial times, post-colonial times. The way Tiku is saying all of these staged wars, and even right now, puppet governments, like you're saying, who are selling off natural resources in the name of national development, but it's only lining their own pockets. Because most of the people in the, let me not say most, but the population of DRC, there's a large number that they're the ones who are impoverished. They're digging out the gold, the diamonds, the coltan, whatever resource it is, but nothing gets to them. It goes to the multinationals or the leaders who are puppets for the West or whatever country, multinational company has its interests. So yeah, I think DRC will just forever have interest. The West will forever have interest and be scrambling for the resources. It's Berlin Conference of 1881 reloaded. Yeah.
Yes, because when you look at neocolonial economies, when you look at not even economies, we're just looking at neocolonialism, it is rooted in, the imbalance of international relations, may it be economies, may it be, your conditional aid and the likes. So when you see the Western states influencing, or rather trying to get these resources from Africa, it also creates that imbalance to say, but if I'm selling this product to you, but you're the same person who is in charge of the market, whether there are conditions to it, whether you want the dollar to rise or it's literally, you're controlling the economies, you're controlling the markets. So there is no way that I'm going to really benefit economically from such an imbalanced system. So yes, I think it is I agree with the ladies that it is a way of the Western states trying to colonize us in the new age era, like using the imbalances and the conditions that they put in place to influence control.
Yeah, I don't know if I can jump in. I feel it's a two-way stream because whilst we are blaming a lot of the Western world, I think a lot has to do with leadership or lack of leadership within most African countries, because I think we're almost playing this victim role. I do agree with what Janila is saying, that yes, they do have a lot of power in terms of what resources can be produced, how they should be produced. And for instance, in Zambia, we produce a lot of copper, but we're not allowed to turn that into finished products. So I do agree that yes, they do have a big role, but I also feel that it also has a lot to do with some of our leaders in Africa, because look at other countries, the Asian tigers, and how they were able to move from that sort of quote unquote neocolonialism to now being one of the biggest leading economies in the world. So I feel it's a two-way stream, and I do feel that it is possible for Africa and Congo in particular to get out of that trap if they do elect the right leaders, because I think it all borders from the leadership component as well.
May I respond to you, Tiku?
Yeah, sure.
I agree. I agree with you. Everything they say, everything rises and falls on leadership. My only issue is when Africa finally decides to produce leaders, they're assassinated or they're blacklisted. Like Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, Steve Biko. I mean, they're like Gaddafi. Fine, he was not the best leader, but he had a vision for Africa. Africa united. The guy was funding like most of the, like a large chunk of the AU budget. So he had a vision. I'm not saying he was the best, but when these few leaders arise and they're saying, no more, we want a united Africa, or even in their own countries, let us have let our sovereignty be intact, let us self-govern, let us manage our resources, then it's an issue. Or even worse, when we were gaining independence, some of our leaders, they signed contracts which are still binding to date. Francophone countries are an example. So no matter how good a leader you are, those contracts are there, they're binding. So yes, leaders in Africa, we need to pull up our socks, like that is like a real thing. But even the few leaders who pull up their socks, they have the West to contend with. And even here in Africa, the whole divide and rule mechanism, it's still in play. Even in the African Union, they won't, like, there's no unity in the African Union. So I don't know, it's catch-22, right? You want to, it's just a myriad of things. But yeah, good leadership would help.
Yeah, but also I think just looking at some of the case studies in these other countries and how they've managed to rise against the West, I think it's also the approaches and the techniques, I feel. I think the problem we have as Africans is that we're very open about what we want to do. We don't work in silence. And I think that often gets us in trouble. I think if we try and imitate, for lack of a better word, what China did, what Japan did to grow their economies, and maybe we can also one day eventually stand up to the Western world. I think the problem that we have as Africans is that we make our plans open, and that in its way, like you can't tell your enemy what you're planning. Like, hey, we want to unite Africa. Obviously, they're going to do whatever it takes to stop that from happening. But I feel if we work in silence in a way, I think we could be able to, one day unite and overpower the West. I'll give an example, and Harry, you can come in and correct me here. But I know Mo mentioned that in East Africa, for instance, you guys have is it one passport or something? And
yeah,
just as a way of trying to unite the East Africans to sort of have this cross-border trade and etc. And I don't know if that's openly known, because I'm Zambian and I had no idea until I met more. So I feel like having some of these strategies that I feel the East Africans, for instance, Paul Kagame and the other leaders are trying to do silently, is the way forward, because we all know that, we have eyes in the skies and all these technologies we're using, people are able to tap in and hear. But I think if we move silently, we should be able to also one day overpower some of these neocolonialism issues that we're facing now.
Yes, I definitely agree with your discussion, ladies. It's such a great discussion. In fact, I'm just enjoying the back and forth because there's actually 2 points which we're gravitating towards the idea that the leaders do have an autonomy of some sort to just basically drive a change for Africa so that we as Africans are not dependence on the West, as well as also being put in a position where we're not too, as you said, Tiku, not being too open about what our plans are. Because once we open about our plans, there's a sense in which other states may even manipulate that to their advantage. Like for instance, when speaking about the DRC, that they spoke about how, oh, we're selling these resources so that we advance our economy. And that could be some, plan that they are opened about, that we want to advance our economy. This is the way we can do it, by selling our resources. But that in itself, it actually goes against what they're wanting to do, because, at the end of the day, it's the West that are actually benefiting from this. And it, just going back to what you're saying, Harry, that it's also seeing how the West consciously wants to be able to control and have power over our assets. And it goes into what Danila was saying, that the conditionalities that are involved because of the fact that they want to still have control over our resources. And so we also have to look into their involvements in that. That's actually such an enlightening discussion, ladies. And it actually just touches on the points of what you briefly mentioned, Tiku, on the involvements of the West and other states in peacekeeping missions, or rather in issues of conflict and war, and how they're so ready to jump into Africa. So that actually goes into our next question of neocolonialism comes in different masks. One of those masks are peacekeeping missions. We have witnessed a number of security interventions in the name of peace, with the likes of missions operating in Sudan, Burundi, DRC, etc. So is there an ulterior agenda besides establishing peace? And I think we actually briefly touched on this, that that is there an agenda? Is it just that we want to establish peace, or is it that, oh, let's establish peace and also see what we can benefit from our intervention?
Yeah, definitely. There is an agenda, and unfortunately, and what most people don't know is that these wars are funded by the West, because most
Mm,
of the soldiers do not have the monies or the equipment to have all these civil unrest in the country, in the different countries in Africa. But one doesn't stop to question, where do these guns come from? You see them in, like, on the TV with a lot of big machines, and these are people in the forest. Like, how did they get that stuff in the forest? So yeah, I do feel that yes, they do have an ulterior motive, and it's important to have an open discussion around, first of all, why they're always helping. And I
mhm,
mean, like, Congo has had these civil wars for decades now, and nothing is helping. So what peace exactly are they actually bringing? Because my understanding is that it shouldn't take this long for the peacekeeping process yeah, to be effective. So yeah, I do feel like they have ulterior motives, and yeah, I also feel that they're the ones that actually fund these wars, and yeah, try and get minerals out of the different countries.
If I could also jump in the discussion, I totally agree with you, Tipu. War is a business. War and peace is a business, and to stay relevant, there must be conflicts. And the West always
mm,
has its fingers inside, especially in places where it has interest. Because also, you have to ask the question, how can they participate in some conflicts, but not in others? How can they send troops to some places, but
mm,
not others? Like,
mm,
and for me, like, a big red flag is the Rwandan genocide in 94. Like, they were well aware the thing was going down, they withdrew the UN troops and allowed, was it close to like 600,000 Rwandese die in the span of 90 days. Didn't lift a finger. But if I come to the example of Kenya, we had in the 2007 election, 2008, we had this post-election violence, which rocked the country for, I think it was a month or 2 or 3 months. I can't recall, but it was nowhere near the magnitude of the Rwandan genocide. And the number of people, any small amount of death is important because it's a human life, but the numbers that perished were nowhere close to the Rwandan genocide. There's a lot of displacement and stuff, but we can't call it, I mean, it was nowhere near the magnitude of the Rwandan genocide. But before 2 weeks were over, the West had already sent emissaries. We had already peacekeeping. I mean, we already had these big names. Kofi Annan came, Benjamin Mkapa, the former president of Tanzania, and we had Grace Machel. She came, brokering peace deals, ensuring that this war is coming to an end, like in the span of 2 or 3 weeks. So you just have to ask yourself, why is the West quick to dip its fingers in Kenya? No, you must have peace. Interfere in the sovereignty of a nation that you have no business in, when there was a different crisis and you did nothing. Or even Sudan right now, like their fingers are there because of the oil reserves. But the Somali war, after Black Hawk Down and the major losses, they withdrew troops. So you just wonder, like, why are, and DRC, because of the resources, there will never be peace in DRC because they can only loot resources when there is chaos. But when there's a semblance of government, when people have rights and they declare their sovereignty and they say, you will not do this without, when there's a structure that can bargain on the international scale, they won't be able to loot resources. So I feel like this war, it's a business. The UN needs to be useful. It needs to have a reason for existing. The Red Cross, all these businesses, they need to, this war, the people who manufacture weapons, where are they going to take their weapons if there's no war? Even the war in Ukraine, it's proxy. It's just Russia and US in Ukraine. I mean, it's Cold War on a different level. So yeah, it's a rather unfortunate story, but yeah, these wars, I don't think they'll ever end because of all these interests, and it is a business.
Yeah. And yeah, like just the usual saying of divide and conquer. I mean, that is how they came to Africa in the first place. And I think that's how they've still maintained their divide and conquer rule. Because I think, yeah, that's the only way they're actually going to get the resources. So I do agree with you, Harry.
When the political conflict started in Eswatini a couple of years ago, everybody was calling out for the international community to speak out or to do some intervention whatsoever, because in a way our mindset is like we need the international intervention to help us with our political situation. But they all of them actually explained to us that they had no business telling us what to do, how to run our country. Like all of them, I'm telling you. I remember I attended one of the workshops on peace building, and people were frustrated. They're like, but why is the UN not responding? We have signed petitions. And they're like, no, Sweden is a sovereign state. We have no business telling you what to do. We can support you through training you on peace building, but other than that, we cannot send people here. We cannot do anything. So I'm like, oh, and then they further explain to us that they have the security, I think it's a security and something, a council, whereby they sit together and decide where the UN should do interventions. So at that time, it was Ukraine. And there was so many stories on social media and TVs on the focus on Ukraine, and the Swatini was like, but we are in a crisis as well. So it's an evidence for me to say that there is this imbalance. If they have interest, they will go above and beyond to find a way to be, peacekeepers. And if they have zero interest, they're like, yo, you're on your own. We don't know. We don't care about that. Of which I think it's okay. It really helped us to come back as a country and decide how we're going to handle our own political conflict. And we are in the process of trying to, keep peace in the country. So, and I recently saw this picture, and it had this sculpture where there is a man sitting on top of another man, and the man below is singing under the burden of this one sitting on top of him. And the one sitting on top of him is like, I will do anything to help him except to step down from his back. And I think that is where we're at with the West. Like they can bring in troops, they can do all of these things, Red Cross, peace, like anything except for actually step down and leave us alone. That's the hypocrisy. That's why we are suffering even today. And I do believe that, peacekeeping missions have the genuinely, some of them anyways, are aimed at promoting peace, protecting civilians and supporting the development of these countries. But ultimately, their other agenda of promoting their self-interest is always there. There is always that ulterior motive, that ulterior agenda, which includes, the whole economic influence of the region, the political influence of the region, and controls over resources. So in as much as they are needed to an extent, but we cannot run away from the truth, of which is there's always that hidden agenda.
Yeah, maybe just to also speak to that, Janelle, I think there's a concept in development studies called dependency theory, and I know probably most of you have heard of it. So I feel that the Western world has deliberately created this dependency syndrome where they're pumping a lot of money aimed at providing development, quote unquote, in quotation marks, and aimed at, like you're saying, peace building, restoring the world, blah, blah, blah. But I think what that has done is made them appear to be like our saviors. And because of that savior complex that they have, we've seen a lot of them jumping into our business as Africa, as Harry was saying, like they had no business in Kenya, but they felt that they needed to interfere. So I think that has really given them this sort of savior complex, but also from the African end, because they're the ones that are feeding us. Let's be honest. A lot of NGOs in Africa pretty much fund a lot of activities and keep a lot of people safe and make sure that they have food on their table. So I think because of that dependency syndrome that has been brought about by aid, we have seen a lot of African leaders running to the West and allowing some of these things. Like Slee, you mentioned the case study of DRC, where they are now saying we're selling these oil reserves because we want to help the children, or to help the Congolese people. When in actual fact, we all know what that selling is going to entail. So I think we've, unfortunately, as Africans, become so dependent on the Western world for guidance, for funding, for peacekeeping, that we have neglected ourselves as Africans, and we've sort of ignored our neighboring countries. So for instance, Lee, why did your country, for instance, rush to the UN instead of rushing to South Africa, for instance, for help? Yeah, so I think it's such things that sort of drive this neo-colonialism in Africa. And this goes back to the point that I had earlier. Whilst it is the Western end's fault, but I also feel that we as Africans have become so dependent on the West. In Zambia, we recently had Vice President Kamala Harris from the US coming to Zambia, and you should have seen what happened. Like, all the roads were closed for 2 days. She came with her own entourage. We're not allowed to roam freely in the streets. Journalists were inspected by US foreign missions just to see if they were having any illegal stuff, which was so weird. Like, this is our country. Why have they taken over our own security wing? So, and I mean, like, no one forced us, but our president allowed that to happen. So there is a lot of dependency syndrome that drives this neo-colonialism in Africa. yeah, I thought I just add to that. Thanks.
And I totally agree with you, like 100%, because this neocolonialism allows for the disconnection of African countries. Because instead of, like what you said, going for South Africa for help, but you want to go to the US for help, who said South Africa doesn't have the resources that you are searching for? Who said South Africa doesn't have the markets that you are searching for? But you want
Yeah.
to go up for the others. And I was also talking to my sister recently, that as Africans, we treat a guest so much better than our own people. Like in a household, you will give the guest the those dining plates that you never use, the those mugs that you never use. I'm telling you, give the guest the best
Hmm.
experience of what happened in your country when um the UN people visited. You give them these experiences that you're not willing any day to give to your fellow housemates. And for as long as we look at the outside people as better, who deserve so much better than our people, then there is no way we're going to get out of this crisis. No way at all.
Yeah, my friend always jokes that we've all been brainwashed. He's very convinced it's in our DNA now to hate one another as Africans. And I don't know where that stems from. I don't know if it was there before the Westerners came, and probably that's why it was maybe easy for them to divide and conquer, or because of the bringing in of religion, sorry to say, but I think a lot of tools have been brought in by the Western world to try and continue colonizing us. And I feel religion is one tool that has been unfortunately used in the African settings. I know as Africans we had our own religions before. I know we believed in one God, etc. But I feel that with religion in itself, and I know here you're a pastor, so you can come in and counter what I'm saying, but I feel that that's also being used as a tool to continue colonizing Africans. I mean, they came in, took our resources, but then said, forgive your enemies, 70 times, blah, blah, blah. And because of that, I think Africans are genuinely forgiving people. And I don't know if we would have been that way with the Westerners if we hadn't been introduced to the religious concepts that they came with.
I actually agree with you, Tiku. Like religion, I think some people had a noble idea, a noble thought. Let's take religion to the continent, Africa. But it came, like what is it called? The Imperial British, the East African Company. Can't remember what it's called, but they came in with the missionaries, and that's how they established imperialism in East Africa. So yeah, I do agree that religion is used as a tool was used as a tool to colonize us, to kind of brainwash us, distance us from our cultures by making us believe that everything African is inherently inferior or demonic or evil. So there was that. But hey, religion is a tool everywhere. Even right now, us Africans are using religion as a tool against their own people. So I guess it's really just the person using the religion. But
Yeah.
I totally agree. I think, like you're saying, we've been brainwashed. Yeah, like we began the series by talking about decolonization of the mind, by liberating our minds from these mindsets that have been ingrained in us, that Western education is the best, their culture is the best, modernization is equals to westernization, and the best doctors are out there, and it's the land of, the American dream. We're all aspiring for that. So I think that's what we've grown up with in our heads, that we must call the outsiders to get help. And I still say that was kind of, I don't know how, pre-colonial Africa exactly was, but there must have been conflicts here and there, but I do think there was unity. But the whole divide and rule tactic really just pitted brother against brother, community against brother, us against them. And we've never ever been able to just come together and say, you know what, as Africa, we have the resources and we can take care of ourselves. The heck with you, Westerners, So it's really, I don't know how we're going to unbrainwash our minds in that regard.
Yeah, and I feel that is what most people are trying to go for, to decolonize their mind. I think because everything starts from there. And once we do that, I think we will be able to make progress. I think there's also a lot, again, bordering around leadership, because whilst the Western world sits down in these different meetings to come up with these different treaties, I feel that if Africans rise up and try and be part of the conversation as much as possible, then probably we will be able to sort of shift the narrative and gain back our power. We now know that we've seen slowly a lot of Africans taking up these big leadership roles. For instance, WHO is headed by an African, even the UNH is now headed by an African. So I feel with us taking up this space in these big international policy-making settings, I think is one way that will help us shift the narrative. And I think we've seen that slowly things have been working towards our benefit in a way, because we have seen a lot of our own people being at the table and making the decisions on our behalf.
Yes, and I agree with you, ladies, that there are opportunities where we can actually be autonomous and make decisions and being able to be united as Africans. I mean, and we've seen this also with what Tiku pointed out with the Asian tigers, that you have the likes of China. And I mean, China's also jumping in to scramble for Africa's resources. And with that as well, it gets into our next question, that when you're looking into, the different masks of neocolonialism, that is not only just the West that's, part of this issue that we're facing, but also you have the likes of China, and we have this kind of question that, do we believe that China has an economic and nationalistic interest, right? Or do they actually genuinely want to advance Africa's economy? Because at the same time, I mean, China wasn't like the West. They were, to an extent, could be relatable in that they themselves built themselves up to be in a position where they can, be involved in certain things like, giving out loans, trying to advance Africa's economy. But at the same time, it's also quite debatable whether China has a genuine need to advance Africa's economy, or is it a national interest? Just like how we've seen with Western states. What are your thoughts, ladies?
I think they're similar to to the Western world. I don't know if people have read the book by a Zambian author, Dambisa Moyo, called Winner Takes All. And this book was written, I think, almost 10 years ago, pretty much talking about the same thing, where Africa is now being scrambled by China. And the reason why a lot of our resources are now going to China is, again, there is a lot of trust there. And they feel that they can trust China to trade with, as compared to, for instance, the US or the UK. But in my opinion, I feel that they're the same, just different devil, but same stuff. Yeah. And because of that, we have seen a lot of resources, even here in Zambia, being taken away by China. We have a lot of timber being exported to China, and a lot of people think timber is used for instance, making furniture, etc. When in actual sense, Chinese are using it for medicines, which they're then making and selling back to us as Africans. So yeah, I think it's just a continued or a new form of colonialism that we're experiencing in Africa because of the China takeover. And unfortunately, our leaders, again, like I said, feel that they can trust China more than the Western world. But also, China understands the African language. And when I say the African language, I mean corruption. Westerners are a little bit subtle in how they have these dealings, but with Chinese officials, they understand that in Zambia, for instance, if you want to buy ABCD, you need to double the amount, because half of that amount will go to corruption. And I think that's one of the reasons why African leaders are getting in bed with China, because they sort of appeal to their inner interests, aka
Mm.
money and corruption. Yeah.
I totally agree with what you said, Tiku. I really don't see a difference between China and the West. In fact, in Kenya, we're having this sort of tug of war. Because if I can say, I think Kenya really started opening its doors to China like from the late 2000s, like 2009, 8, thereabout. I remember I was doing an internship in our national broadcaster. It's called Kenya Broadcasting Corporation. And I was an intern there, and the government had allowed a Chinese news station, TV station. I think it's called CCTV or something CCTN, something like that. They had their own wing in the national broadcasting station, and no African was allowed inside that wing. Only Chinese. They were the only ones inside a Kenyan broadcasting station. They have their own wing, and it's only Chinese technicians allowed inside there. Now you have to ask yourself questions if you're already starting to sell your country that way. And like over the course of the years, we've allowed China to do so many development projects. They've built our roads. They gave us we have a train, the standard gauge railway, SGR. They're the ones who brought it. And guess what? In all these major projects, they brought their own technicians, they brought their own workers. So it's not like it even created massive employment for Kenyans. The Chinese were creating employment for themselves. They brought their technicians, they brought their workers, and even our train, the SGR, the senior technicians were from China, and the instructions are in Chinese. So if there's like any major thing, you have to call somebody from China to fix it. So really, how do they really have their interests at heart? They're not teaching you to fish. They're just selling you fish so that you can go back to the source again and again. There's so many shops, Chinese shops, we're really importing their things, but it's at the cost of our own local products. So if they really were having our best interest at heart, they'd try to be like, okay, let me give you this, but it's so that you can be able to stand on your own. But it's the example that Nile was saying. They're sitting on our backs and yeah, I'll do anything to help you except get off your back. So there's really no difference between China and America. There are two superpowers who are looking for how they can fulfill their interest in Africa. And unfortunately, because of our leaders, whatever gain they're having to line their pockets, they're selling us out.
Yeah, most definitely. Because yeah, China's engagement in Africa is very complex, and it's not clear about their motivation, but we see that it's clear. What is clear is their strategic interest on Africa, on the African continent, especially their desire to promote their global influence, because now we have seen the tug of war between America, well, the Western region and China. So they have though invested heavily in Africa's infrastructure. But then the problem with these economic benefits is that what you've just said, it doesn't necessarily, when you look at the value chain, the value chain of whatsoever development, it doesn't necessarily benefit the average person living in the rural part of Eswatini, probably because they are going to bring in their own engineers. They're going to bring in their own skill set, their own materials from China to come and build a road in Eswatini. And the labor that the economic, we're creating jobs that are going to, every time there is an infrastructure development in Africa, they will tell you that they will be creating 700 jobs. And those 700 jobs will probably be someone earning $4 a week, probably, or $4 a day. And what is that? How much is it? How is that going to improve the person mentally, health-wise, economic-wise? How is that going to benefit the economy of the country if everything else, the major spendings are going to the country, which is supposedly helping us develop this particular infrastructure? So I honestly do not think that they have our best interest. In fact, when it comes to money and political global influence, nobody has Africa's interest at heart. That is the truth. So I would also support that their investment in Africa is definitely driven by our raw materials, because they want to expand their markets for exports and investment opportunities. And they are providing these loans and debts to African countries. And I've heard that they are buying more land in Africa. They're also building more China cities, what you call China malls. I think it's China towns or something. But those things are just an evidence to say that these people, they do not care about you. They have no interest on you. They just want to take and take, just like everybody else.
But that's the thing, right? Because they didn't come into Africa with a gunpoint. At gunpoint, African leaders allowed them in, and this is one thing that people need to really be like. I think have this hard conversation, because I don't think China can just land in Africa and start buying land. You know, our own traditional leaders are selling land. Our own government leaders are selling the land. For instance, in Zambia, you can't buy land as a foreigner unless you've stayed here for at least 10 years, I believe. But we see a lot of Chinese coming in within a month or two, they're buying land. Others even go to an extent of working with local Zambians to buy land. So, for instance, I buy land as Chico, and I know in actual sense it's for this Chinese person. So, I think ish, Africa needs to go through a lot of, I think, decolonizing sessions for them to really value themselves, value their resources, because I don't personally feel that our leaders value our resources as much as they should. I'll give an example in Zambia where we have these national parks, and lo and behold, our own president was exporting a lot of animals to China and all these other countries. So if we cannot protect our own natural resources, then who will, right? So I feel we have a huge role to play in ensuring that our resources are not depleted come 2050 or in a few years to come.
Yes, that is actually very true, ladies, because as you guys had rightly said, that there seems to be no difference between the Western states versus with China. There's a national interest, and there's also a need to advance their economy, not Africa's economy, but their economy. And so it actually goes into the next question. Our final question is, what is the solution? So many African countries have adopted the DRC government's approach that auctioning off their resources will advance their economies. However, through this discussion, we can see that African governments are somewhat supporting the neocolonial agenda. So, what do we do? How do we, as Africans, take control over our economies? So that is definitely a question that I think a lot of us would like to know as to how do we take control over our economies?
I think I've mentioned most of the alternatives. I think taking up leadership space at global level to shift the policy discussions, to have our leaders value our resources, put up strict policies, internal policies, to protect our natural resources, because I don't think there's a lot being done at the local level or regional level to ensure that our resources are not, exploited. I also feel there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of also, like I mentioned earlier, taking up a lot of space in this policy, global level spaces, so that we have policies that favor Africans, unlike the current policies that are there that do not allow Africans, for instance, to produce finished products. And yeah, so I think there is a lot that needs to be done. And I feel that at the core of it all, yes, it is the Western world's fault. Yes, it is China's fault. But I think we have a role as Africans to protect our resources, because we all know that the reason why all these different countries are coming to Africa is because that's where everything is. And we as Africans should be able to know that without our resources, then the world can't function. Yeah. So I think we need to protect our resources.
Definitely, definitely. I like that. Stricter, rules or basically regulations in place so that there's not this sort of influx of external, countries, Western states coming in and just buying our resources or buying land and etc. But being able to protect our resources through these particular regulations and just stricter leadership, even like a more advanced leadership where we value our stance as Africans, our autonomy or sovereignty.
I don't know. I think yes, Tuku has really mentioned most of the major issues, but I think when we are decolonized in terms of the mindset has been decolonized, and then we can be more confident in terms of developing our economies, and we need our young people in these governance positions, in these leadership positions, and we need more women as well
Mm,
to
mm,
sit in this position because I feel like every the gender has a role to play, and also the age as well has a role to play in terms of the vision for Africa. Where do we go as Africans from here to actually decolonizing our economies and decolonizing our politics and everything, culture and the likes? Because now, even if we do engage in those regional or international policy making processes that with our international partners, but if we have the same mindset, if we have really the same way of thinking, then there is no way out of this situation because we'll have the same corrupt people who have been practicing this system for so many years, decades even, saying the very same thing, negotiating for the very same deals because they do not have the Africans' interest at heart. They're just full of greed and whatsoever else that they're pushing their own personal agendas. But if you get a fresh mindset, fresh people who haven't been through these systems, even people who are eager to change, it might happen that you've been in the system for so long, but you are eager to change it. So let's have those people sit in those positions whereby they can influence and make sure that they serve Africa's best interest at heart.
I just want to add, maybe before Harry comes in briefly, that I think Westerners are very tactical in how they do their things, and it starts from subtle things like training programs, getting the cream de la cream of Africa, flying them to a nice place. I won't mention where. And just really starting the mindset control, because I think I agree with what Janela is saying, that young people are key, but I feel that young people also need to be careful with some of these Western ties that they come across. There's a lot of programming that starts with young people, giving them these leadership positions or these trainings that are in a way sort of changing or molding them to believe that the Western world is ABCD. So I think, yes, young people are the key, but also I think young people are at risk of being controlled at an early stage. And so there is need to really be careful with what you consume as a young person when it comes to these different quote unquote Western opportunities that young people come across, because they are also a tool of colonizing the African minds.
I agree with Nile that yes, I feel the youth have a large portion to play in this. They are 75% of the African continent. So can you imagine if the youth in every country just told its leaders, stop your nonsense, this is what we want, govern us well? They would hold their government at ransom and, they would have an actual say. But also, I agree with what you're saying, Tiku. They are the vulnerable ones because, like you're saying, the West are very tactful, they're very cunning, and that's why all of these programs, the fellowships, the sponsorships, the programs where you can do your studies abroad, they want 18-year-olds to 35-year-olds so that they can impression them, because they're in for the long haul. They're playing the long con game. In their head, they're like, we're training these 18-year-olds today because 20 years from now they'll be on our side. will have allies. Like they're playing the long game. They have that end goal in sight. But I feel us as Africans, we're not long-sighted. Even when we're taking the aid, we're not seeing 20 years from now, how is this aid helping me? When we're doing all of these projects, it's just right now, what can I gain right now? So I do believe that the youth are the solution. They might not be the whole solution. That I mean, they're the majority. Then why don't we then, as in our different African countries, then turn the narrative, rewriting our own history in our own work? You do have a say. The West is not the Messiah. Like if we can just train the youth ourselves before they get into the hands of the Westerners or even the East, then even when they go for these trainings, they already know that they are of value and that they are change makers in spite of whatever assistance they're getting from the West or the East.
Thank you so much, ladies, for these solutions that you have in terms of how we as Africans can take control of our economies. Now, does any one of you have any closing remarks in concern with what we discussed? Perhaps you want to say a few points. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say neocolonialism is real and um, is a threat to the development of Africa. And I feel that it is high time that this conversation is had by a lot of different African leaders, particularly. I don't know if the AU is addressing this issue at all, but if not, I feel that it is high time that this discussion starts being held in these different high-level meetings, because if we don't do anything, then we will be back to square one, back to us fighting for our independence. So yeah, I think there is urgent need for African leaders to put their minds together and fight the current neocolonialism happening in Africa from both the Western and China. Thank you.
Yes, I totally agree with Tiku. I think for me, it's all just everything on colonialism, decolonization, and decolonization. Obviously, we need to be aware that our colonial history is affecting us. Once we are aware, we have the potential to do something about it. If we have to write more articles, if we need more podcasts on it, just talk and engage people so that they can understand that some things they can change. It is not, we can change the status quo. This is not it. We don't need to settle for the bare minimum. If the West or any other country wants to help us, then they should cancel our debts with the World Bank and IMF. Like, you really want to help us, then actually help. So if we are in a place as Africans where we understand that, yes, we do have serious leadership and governance issues, but we also have these colonized mindsets of which we have the power to change, then let's work on that. Let's make Africa better for our children so that they do not have to suffer through the same thing. We do not have to pass down the same thing that has been passed down by our forefathers who went through the system and were not able to get out mentally. We have the privilege of being aware, at least now. I think with the age of technology and the likes, we do have that advantage. So let's use it. Let's capacitate ourselves. Let's read and try to change the status quo. Let's not do the same thing that has been done for ages. We can change these things, even if it starts with the podcast as we are doing Sleep today. But we have to start somewhere. We need to be the young people who are aware and who are solution driven. We cannot stay and do these things forever. So for me, I think that is it. Let's try to change and find solutions that are going to benefit Africans. And also, lastly, it's mostly on us being more united, because for us to conquer, we really need to be united. We used to look at our neighboring countries as not enemies, but actually people that you can collaborate and work together with to come up with solutions that are Africa-centric. Thank you.
I'd like to also give in my parting shot by just agreeing with what has been said. For us to be able to overcome neocolonialism, we really just need to be united. The African Union actually needs to be the African Union. Let's be a borderless continent. Let's just have a one goal. And of course, in our individual countries, let us demand for leaders who actually serve us, stand for us, and are willing to go toe to toe with foreign powers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, ladies, for your closing remarks. So now the decolonization series was so impactful and enlightening. I can't believe that this is the end of our series. We spoke about the need to decolonize our minds as Africans. It is important to recognize our worth and conscientize our beauty and intelligence, which speaks to the need to preserve our native languages. Decolonizing language means embracing the unique qualities of our languages, which feeds into accepting our diverse cultures. So we as Africans have the opportunity to rewrite our history about our cultures, which are often portrayed as barbaric by the West or the former colonizers. So the third podcast has shown that we must preserve our cultures in honor of our ancestors and for the future generation. Likewise, the fourth podcast focuses on preserving our land and wildlife. The conversation on decolonizing conservation indicates that conservation is relevant in the African context. Furthermore, it is important that local communities are involved in conservation efforts. So now our final episode ends with a telling conclusion that our economies are still held hostage by the West, with the exception of rising Chinese influence, or aka the East. So this should be a wake-up call for African governments, policymakers, officials, etc., to make considerable efforts for Africans to have power over their economies and resources without it being squandered by the East or the West. So thank you for joining us today. Do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And thank you to our guest Tiku for participating in this interesting discussion. So be on the lookout for our next series. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye.